should I? Okay.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Jacopo, for joining us. This is the very first of the Protocol Spotlight series, where we interview authors of research methods that are published as papers in PLOS ONE and as protocols, corresponding protocols on protocols.io. And my name is Lenny. I'm the CEO and co-founder of protocols.io. We'll be conducting the informal conversation with Gabriel, who is also on this call and is the head of outreach at protocols.io. And he will introduce our guest. But just before I hand over to Gabriel, very quickly, what I wanted to say is that we're super excited to have this first interview with Jacopo, and the goal for launching this series is to add a little bit more color to the protocols that are shared, to have conversations around what it took to develop the methods, because very frequently when we publish papers, when we publish protocols, it's a series of steps. It looks straightforward enough, but sometimes behind are months or years of work trying to get those particular protocols in shape, figuring out what's the best way to do it, ups and downs, roller coaster of research and optimizing methods. And we want to hear about some of those ups and downs, the story behind the protocol, the context, some of the things that for people that are trying to follow the step-by-step instructions that might make their life easier, what might be the mistakes. So we'll touch on these types of questions. Want to see, are there negative results? Was there a lot of trial and error? So we'll see where this conversation goes, but it is a particular pleasure to start this series with Jacopo, who has been just a champion of open science and one of those shining examples of people openly sharing their knowledge. And it's particularly appropriate because as part of the Protocols.io partnership with PLOS ONE Lab Protocols initiative, where protocols are peer-reviewed and published in PLOS ONE, the paper we'll be talking about today from Jacopo is the very first one that was published as part of that initiative. So Jacopo, you're sort of our guinea pig, but we're super excited to have you, and I'll hand over to Gabriel from there.
Thank you, Lenny. As Lenny mentioned, so today we are recording our first spotlight, and it is really our pleasure to have our first guest, who is also the author of the first lab protocol ever. And it is Dr. Jacopo Niccolò Cerasoni. So very excited to have you here. Jacopo is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Biology at Loyola University, Chicago. As a paleoecologist and archaeologist, Jacopo applies a variety of ecological, paleontological, and archaeological methods to answer questions concerning evolutionary patterns in biological and cultural dynamics. And his work has brought him to work in contexts ranging from Middle Miocene North America, Pleistocene West Africa, Iron Age Europe, and late Holocene South America, among others. Jacopo is an adamant supporter of reproducible and open access science, and he strives to share and implement accessible methods to all, regardless the position, institution, or location. So we will begin the interview now, and we would like Jacopo for you to explain us briefly what the protocol we will be talking about is about, how you use it, and why it is relevant.
Well, let me first say thank you, Lenny, thank you, Gabriel, and the whole Protocols.io team for this invitation and for the amazing platform you created. Without it, I wouldn't have been able to do any of this work. In terms of this paper, so dealing with stone tools illustration with vector art, I called it STIVA, and I'll be calling it STIVA from now on, just for sake of timing. The protocol itself has as objective the illustration of lithic artifacts. They're also called stone tools. They are material culture produced by humans in the past and present. And stone tools are simply natural materials that are knapped or flake removed. And they can be found in the archaeological record. Many of the times, especially nowadays, there's a tendency for photography of these lithic tools when you want to include them into publications or public outreach projects. However, many materials from which stone tools are made are very difficult to photograph, whether they be shiny, whether the removal scars from the production of them is very difficult to see in a photograph, which is 2D. So one method that it's used nowadays and that has been used for decades and centuries is drawing these lithics, showing only the morphological features that are interesting archaeologically. So what this method does effectively is it takes this century-old tradition of drawing lithic artifacts, but it sort of gives it a modern technological twist by offering an optimized step-by-step method for this illustration of lithic artifacts using modern technology and creating a standardized method for this so that we don't only draw stone tools for publication of them, for example, but we also create illustrations that can be produced by many different people in such a similar way that we can then compare them and add valuable comparative data sets, which couldn't have been done previously as they were only mostly done by hand and with quite a strong artistic representation, which is very subjective.
And that actually reminds me, our background with Gabriel, our PhDs are in molecular biology, but it reminds us of the issues with handling samples with the protocols that you use. If you're not all doing the same thing with the liver tissue, it's very hard to compare the results, right? And contrast if you didn't follow the exact same thing. But following up on what you just said, in terms of the motivation to optimize the protocol, you were doing, I think this was during your PhD that
yes,
that this work was done. Like, what was that motivation? And it takes time, right? It takes time to share these methods. What was the motivation? Why did you decide that this is worth taking a chunk out of my PhD to make accessible to others?
It's a great question. And I think the motivation came out of months of work that I wouldn't have had to do if it was for a protocol of this kind. If it did exist, I would have saved a lot of time and effort. And the issue I had was, so my PhD had to do with archaeological Paleolithic sites throughout West Africa. And it's a region that has been studied for centuries, and many different lithics, which I studied, were studied by many different people and throughout the region. And when going through the literature for them, I was able to look at these lithics through the illustrations, but given the chronological and geographic distance between these sites and the publications, it was very difficult to compare lithics, even within the same region, because they were drawn and published by different people. So trying to figure out, for example, type A stone tool from Nigeria versus type A from Senegal, they could have been the same tool, but given how they were drawn, I wasn't sure about that. And this was my main motivation to hopefully aid people in the future. It's going to take a while, but hopefully help people in the future to not have to go through the grueling process, especially given that in archaeology, we already have so many little variables we can control. Being able to add a further level of a new degree of control over the data we produce motivated me to sort of help the field develop a little bit further.
And just building on that, I think you sort of answered our next question, which was, Gabriel, right? It was going to be, what about the previous method? Why didn't that work? Why did you have to put the effort into this?
There weren't really any previous methods. I mean, no specific methods for the illustration of lithic artifacts. I did a wide variety of courses on archaeological illustration by several people, and everyone had their own little twist and their own little tricks, especially because it's so artistic. You can't really put steps onto how to move or place your hand or how much pressure you could, but would be kind of difficult. But there weren't really any protocols. There were no protocols on this, and the methods were just very time consuming and way too subjective.
Right, so that makes sense. And I remember seeing you publish the protocol directly on protocols.io before the lab protocols peer-reviewed paper. And then I think you tweeted it, and there was a lot of attention to it, a lot of discussion and excitement around that. I was excited to see it shared. I think it may have been one of the first, if not the first, protocol from anthropology shared on protocols.io. And we welcome all research methods, but there is a bias. Historically, there is a bias towards biomedical. But I remember you sharing on protocols.io, and it takes time to develop these things. And you're clearly, from what we're hearing, you're driven. You want to be able to people to compare, and your goal was to take out the subjective, some of the subjective nature of the illustrations. But you took the time to develop the step-by-step instructions, then you shared them really beautifully on protocols.io, and that takes time. And then you went above and beyond when you were invited by the PLOS ONE team. You went above and beyond, and you turned it into a peer-reviewed paper, right? Which is another effort. It takes even more time. Right now, you have to work with the editorial and reviewers. So why did you go to the next step? Like, I've shared it. I'm done. I paid my dues for open science. I shared my knowledge openly. Why did you decide to submit it as a lab protocol?
Well, the motivation behind that was twofold. I still remember when I had put together the protocols.io protocol. I had shared it. It was doing well. It had a lot of positive feedback. And then one day I received this email out of the blue from the PLOS team saying that you had created this new option of publishing a lab protocol. And I think I just rushed and started writing the PLOS ONE Lab Protocol the same day, if not submitting it within that week. I was just very excited. The motivation of that excitement was superficially, of course, I was a PhD student, kind of striving for a good publication record, and it was an amazing opportunity for that, especially given that it's a peer-reviewed process. But in terms of the methodology part of it, I really liked the idea of having a protocol and have only that peer-reviewed. I had talked to colleagues about the protocol. I had taken some suggestions, but I found that the peer review method would have been the perfect case study to really test any possible negative aspects of the protocol. And I really wanted it to just be the best it could be, because protocols and methods are meant to be as reproducible as possible, if not perfect, so to speak. So that was the big part that made me want to do it, just to test the protocol. And if at the time I thought if it does achieve the point of publication, which I wasn't sure at the start, it would have given me even more sort of happiness and pride towards the method itself, which is something that I was hoping for. And the last thing in terms of this is, it was a good opportunity to sort of fill in some of the gaps that I felt when putting together the protocol, such as giving it more background, citing the people that I took from. There were a lot of people that I took from, and citing them, giving them the space they needed for me to admit that, yes, it comes from these sources and this is the twist I gave to it. And I thought that was an amazing opportunity to do that.
I found it really amazing and generous that one of your main motivations is to give credit to the work of the people upon which you build your methodological developments. I think that getting credit for your own work is extremely valid, is what most people want to do. But I find it very, very generous that you think about, this is a way for me to acknowledge, recognize, and give credit in terms of citation to the people that helped me or inspired me to develop this method. But I want to build now on the peer review. And I want to know if you can share a little bit of the detail of how the process, the peer review process, the feedback, the formalized feedback that you received from the colleagues that read your paper before official publication in a journal shaped your protocol.
Well, that was a big part of the putting together the methods, and it was most definitely the most time-consuming process throughout the whole package. The peer review process itself for this protocol started well before there even was a protocol. So it's a method that, as Lenny hinted at, it took months, if maybe over a year. It was so very confusing times, but it took a very long time to sort of hone and figure out how to do things. And the process started with me starting my PhD and starting to do lithic illustrations. I had done them quite a lot in the past, but trying to do it with Vectorial software, so with this modern technological programs. And it started very slow and doing some for fun. And then I was included by my supervisor at the time on a publication, and I was asked to do lithic illustrations because of the raw material was not good enough for photographs. And that started, I think, maybe 6 months of me producing illustrations, going to Dr. Sherry and Dr. Graukut and having them look at them with the stone tool next to it and suggesting maybe this should be a little bit like this, maybe this should change this way. And it's both technical aspects such as make this line thicker, make this part this direction, but it was also in terms of the general composition, which was a big part of the whole protocol. And that whole continuous back and forth made me not only learn how to do it, but also gave me a different perspective. As you can see, the protocol sort of is one method for a lot of different applications and possible materials and samples. You could do any kind of stone tool with it, and we're talking about more than 3.3 million years of age in the whole globe. So that back and forth helped a lot, and it took so long and it was so in depth that by the time I had the final protocol in, I was lucky enough for the actual peer review process to be quite easy. At that point, it was almost ready to be published. But yeah, the first step of the back and forth, figuring out, and it took a lot of work also from my side to try and make it as simple as possible. Instead of doing 4 different functions and steps, try to find one that does all of that. And that took a lot of experimentation and fiddling around for sure.
And with the peer review itself, if we're not mistaken, you published the peer review history, right? So not just the open protocol and open access paper, but you opened the peer review history. Was that a hard decision, or was that natural? Like, why did you decide to open it up?
I don't know. The way I see academic publishing, it wasn't a hard decision. My thought process behind it was, why not? I've been in not many, but a few publication groups, so to speak, and I've published some things myself, and I came to realize that every peer review process will have negative comments and it will never be as nice as you hope. So I don't see a reason why not to. It's just a learning experience for others to look at if they wish to do so. And it's just, everyone goes through it one way or another. So there's nothing to be embarrassed about.
Well, we asked this. I love seeing the peer review back and forth because it gives you, like this interview itself, it gives you an extra insight into what did other people think, what does the author think. The response to reviewers can be very enlightening. But my hope is that over time, as more and more people open their peer review histories, my hope is that we get away from negative to more constructive. If I'm thinking that I'm writing this and other people will see it, it's not just anonymous and closed, then maybe it gets us to a place where we routinely do more constructive rather than destructive reviews. So that's my personal hope, but it's always interesting to see the perspectives that authors have on this.
I totally agree. And to add to that, if there has to be any kind of negative review to it, it won't be aggressively negative. Like, as you can see from the peer review of this particular article, there were some changes to be made, but no offense was taken because of the wording behind it. But definitely, I agree that being open, reviewers would review with a different kind of hands most of the times, which would be nice to see.
Yeah, and changing gears slightly, although, I mean, you've mentioned that your dialogue with colleagues didn't start at the time of submission to PLOS ONE. It was a long process with your closer collaborators to get the protocol ready. So probably there were many things that you tried that didn't work and didn't make it to the final version of the protocol. And this is the part that I think will be really illustrative to the users of the protocol to know, because that is information that never appears, like what you tried and didn't work. That's something that I am myself an experiment or was an experimentalist, and that's information that you never read anywhere. What has been done and doesn't work. So, and because there were like many months between you started and you get the protocol ready, there are probably many things, but I don't know if you can go into the details of those that were most obvious or more shocking to you, things that you were expected to work but didn't, and didn't make it to the final version of the protocol.
Well, there were many, as you said, they're expected, and there's always many, and most of them were completely out of my control. Most of the errors that I tried to make work, but they didn't, and they didn't end up in the final version. Many of the times it was related to either the equipment that I was using, and that in this specific case is the softwares being used, as it's mostly computational. For example, I tried using other softwares that did work and you could do what the protocol wants you to do. However, it just took so much more time and so many more steps that it became not really worth putting down onto the protocol. One example, the main example with this protocol, and the only real critique I got was that the protocol illustrates the method using payment-based softwares. And that's the only big regret I have, is not including the free-to-use alternatives onto it. Not only putting the names, because they did, is actually putting the whole step-by-step protocol for those softwares. And it didn't make it into the final version of protocol because it's just so time-consuming to create, and it would be almost 3 to 4 times as long. That it didn't work for that specific time frame, but I would like someday to come back to it and make that as well. Another big thing that didn't make it into the final version, regretfully, is further illustration features. Things like depth perception, so gradients within the illustration, or more complex kind of functions that usually you can draw by hand quite easily, but through a computer system, I never really figured it out to be used so globally as everything else. And someday I'll come back to it, but for now it just didn't work, and it's going to reside in the back of my head.
The challenge with using paid tool like Adobe, in my postdoc experience, when I was sharing protocols, I was using MATLAB, and I would share the MATLAB scripts, but I was also thinking not everyone has MATLAB, but it was beyond me to bypass that. There was another person in the lab who independently built Python packages to do what we're doing in MATLAB and shared that openly, but you can't do everything. And I think by you already putting so much into developing it, even if it's not perfect, right? And even if it doesn't put it in the hands of everyone, if they don't have the paid software, hopefully you're allowing others to build on it, and not everything should be on your shoulders, right? You're making the method available, you're putting it out there, and hopefully other people, what you don't have time for, other people can pick up and maybe take it to, an even broader ideal space that you're hoping for. But
yeah,
I don't think people can ask you if you're already going above and beyond. I don't think people necessarily can ask you, and now can you take another year and do this and build software that other people can use for free?
Well, if there is funding for it, I wouldn't say no, but in terms of this free-to-use software, I did offer some sort of one-to-one courses with classes, and we did do some in-person practice of the protocol using free-to-use softwares, and it worked fine. And as I said, and as I'm sure it was your case with MATLAB, the steps are the same. Just if I tell you to do function X with this process, it won't work. Find your own process. So it's more of a technical rearrangement. The protocol itself and the science of itself always applies. So it's, yeah, it works, and it's just a matter of figuring it out. And I've talked to many people that have used the free-to-use softwares on their own, and it always worked fine. And as you said, people are always free to develop upon them, and that's one of the main reasons why I like these open protocols so much, because they're free to use and to change. And as a matter of fact, this specific protocol has been forked on protocols.io a few times, and I've heard of people that are working on the free to use side of it. So I was so lucky that I didn't even have to ask myself or anyone else to do it. It's already being done.
We look forward. Would love to see that. That really is what the platform is for. It's people like you sharing, and other people then building on it and sharing branches, other versions of it.
And to those, sorry,
go ahead, please.
No, I was gonna say, but I don't wanna, because I was gonna ask another question, so I don't know.
Go ahead, yeah.
So to those current and as well as to the future users, your protocol, I think, has 50 steps that are separated into 13 sections. What is, in your experience, the most critical steps in your protocol?
The number one step, I would say, is not a step. It's knowing what the protocol steps are, but also having the fundamental knowledge to put it into practice. And that means, in this case, knowing how to analyze a stone tool. and how to understand what the features are, know the morphology even before starting any of the steps. Sort of not going into it blind, because the way I envision this is a method for the illustration, but it's not meant to be a lecture, so to speak. The second one is definitely photography, because you're taking an object that's three-dimensional, and with one simple click, you're making it two-dimensional. So knowing if you're doing things right, if the lighting is correct, the backgrounds, the lens distortion, so forth, if that is done right, then you know that the final product will be true to the original. But just one wrong thing in the photograph will mess everything else up. You can change a line on Adobe Illustrator, but if you want to change a line based on a photograph that's incorrect, you have to start all over.
And we can imagine that there are steps in there which take 3 seconds. It's, you know, click here and open that file. And then there's steps like take a photograph that you might have to do over and over and change the lighting. Are there other parts of this, similar to what Gabriel was asking, are there other parts of this that are particularly tricky that you can easily get wrong and then go down the wrong path, in addition to the photography itself that you're talking about?
There is, I would say, that comes to mind, the only sort of section that can get tricky and can be done wrong without realizing is the ripples. So in a stone tool, it's really easy to see the outline of it, because it's the outline of it. The borders between the scars are quite easy because you just see the highest point of a flake or of a scar of a flake. The actual ripples within it, so trying to reconstruct the directionality of the flake from where it was removed and which direction it went, that can be very tricky. And the step itself, technically it's easy. It's just a few functions on Illustrator and a couple tools. It's actually one tool and 2 functions. So it's really simple, but knowing where to put those ripples and how to draw them, that's the tricky part. And I tried giving as much information as I could, but this links back to the knowing lithic tools. And it's not a complicated matter. It just takes a bit of getting used to. It's not rocket science, honestly. As long as you know what a flake looks like and how it behaves, just doing a basic course, it's more than enough. But that definitely is the trickiest part. And it was the trickiest part for me when trying to develop the protocol, like learning myself how to illustrate them as easily and as well as possible was the most difficult part.
And, you know, as user of your own protocol, and again, like, you know, building up the story that you told us about the length that it took for you to get things right, since publication, have you made new discoveries about things that could be done better in relationship that the protocols that was published? Has there, in other words, is there any further optimization of the protocol after publication?
Partially. I say partially because the steps and the protocol itself, it hasn't changed. The tools used have changed, as especially Adobe softwares, they change every year. And they usually add tools, they don't take them away. So I found how to do certain things with new tools or updated tools. However, the protocol can still be used in the exact same way because the tools that were included in it are still in the exact same position and location. So that's why it's partially. One thing I have changed, doing it more after the publication, is I haven't changed any of the steps. I just started doing minor changes in terms of, for example, distance between the ripples or the thickness of the lines. I tend to, but it's more of a day-to-day kind of change, depending on how I feel. It's more of a visual representation of it, which doesn't change the final product whatsoever. But sometimes if I feel that two ripples look better closer compared to farther away, I'll do it. But we're talking about 2 to 3 pixel distance. It's just me being a bit crazy about it more than anything.
That is great. And looking back also, you know, in the hindsight, now that you've started the postdoc, when you look back in terms of the significance of the lab protocol for your career development, and just looking back, you know, hopefully you're not regretting doing this. Like, how do you feel it fit into your PhD and into the postdoc transition and the reception of the lab protocol paper from your perspective?
I'm extremely proud of it. One of the things I'm really happy about is that, of course, it aided me in the completion of my PhD and me getting a PhD. It's one of the things that, in my specific case, my PhD reviewers were really happy about and were really impressed by. So that's a point of honor for myself. But at the same time, I'm really happy of having it done for my own personal PhD, because it sort of gave a methodological section to it. While especially in anthropology is usually research project centered. So a context, a time period, a culture, being able to also develop a method and including a more technical aspect to it, I thought it complemented that really well. And although my PhD was specific to a time period and a region, I managed to add this methodological aspect that sort of went past those boundaries. Another really good thing that I think this protocol has done for my career is the recognition it gave me. As Lenny, you were saying, at first it kind of blew up. Many people started following along and were interested and got in touch with me. I was lucky enough to have been invited to lectures and practical sessions at various universities. And for just a standard, quite niche archaeological method, I think the article right now, after a year, has 4 citations in it, and I've heard of people that are putting together the manuscripts and they've been using it as well, and that's something that I'm very proud of, and I think it has helped my career quite a lot.
I have to say, Gabriel, you'll finish up in a second. We just also want to be respectful to your time and not make these too long so people can actually listen through.
I'm talking too much.
No, not you. I'm the one who talks too much. But I did, on a personal note, want to say, in the beginning, you said thank you for building, you know, a wonderful platform that allows us to do it. But I feel really strongly that you can build the most wonderful platform, the most beautiful tool, and if researchers like you don't want to share, don't come to share, and don't make their knowledge publicly available, it is useless, right? Like Wikipedia without content, there is no Wikipedia. So without people like you, and in the beginning, when we're starting this 10 years ago, I remember getting questions from more skeptical people: would scientists really share? Don't they want to hold on to the methods that they've developed so they can get extra papers and more research and outcompete others? And I felt like, well, we don't need everyone sharing, but there's got to be enough. Just like Wikipedia doesn't need everyone to edit it, but you need enough. And people like you are really at the heart of leading to success of open repository of methods. So, you know, we'll take credit for building the platform, but there would be no protocols.io without researchers like you. So just really, really grateful for the time for this interview, for the knowledge that you're sharing, for the questions you're answering from the community, bringing, you know, you've shared another version of this protocol, you've published many others, and it really is for researchers like you, and thanks to researchers like you that Protocols.io exists.
Thank you, it means a lot.
And I also want to highlight something that I think it's really important that you mentioned in answering your last question, which is about, by publishing a protocol as a standalone piece, you make that part of your work more discoverable, right? Because if it were just part of your thesis or your final research paper, it will be circumscribed within the question that you care about. And specific to your particular time point, the particular part of Africa where you worked, and people working on other areas, other continents, might find it more difficult to find the specific tool that they need. Whereas if you publish your protocol as a standalone, it doesn't matter. You know, it goes beyond the boundaries of, in this case, the question, the scientific question that motivates you. I found it very revealing what you said, and I just hope that our listeners picked up on this. But as Lenny said, you know, we want to be respectful of your time and to the listeners' time. So the last question, which is actually a pretty open question, is for you to let us know if there's anything else you would like to share that we didn't ask to this point.
I think one thing I would like to share that is not directed specifically at you, it's more directed at the audience, is to, if you audience have any new ideas, if you would like to see something that's done differently or that produces results in a different matter, just experiment and try it. On the off time, if something works out, try to bring it forward, because not only you will gain from it, but so many more people will be able to make good use of it, and that will always come back one way or another. I'm a big believer in karma, but if you manage to create something new, it's gonna stay forever. More than a specific really good article, more than 1 degree, the methods and the way you do things is what truly passes on through social learning. And just try and experiment. Something will come out of it one way or another, and it's never bad.
That is beautifully said, and it's perfect for our opening spotlight series. So just again wanted to thank you so much for taking the time. I feel a wave of energy just from this conversation. Like, this is what we really built the platform for, and it's really rewarding to talk to a researcher like you. So thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all. And I feel at home at protocols.
I want to congratulate you as well for your new position.
Thank you.
I hope that you are enjoying the Wind City.
It's starting to get windy. We'll see how it goes.
And
thank you.
It has been a pleasure. It has been very enlightening, very invigorating. And yeah, thank you very much.
Well, thank you both for everything.